Hi everyone and welcome back to Heimler's History. At long last we have got to the Civil War. And if Shelby Foote, who penned one of the greatest narratives of the Civil War, is to be believed, then it is more necessary for us to understand the Civil War than any other event in American history, because it is this event that shaped the soul of our nation more than any other. Here's how he says it. Any understanding of this nation has to be based, and I mean really based, on an understanding of the Civil War. The Revolution did what it did. Our involvement in European wars, beginning with the First World War, did what it did. But the Civil War defined us as what we are, and it opened us to being what we became, good and bad things. It was a crossroads of our being. Before the war, it was said, "The United States are." Grammatically, it was spoken that way and thought of as a collection of independent states. After the war, it was always "the United States is," as we say today without being self-conscious at all. And that sums up what the war accomplished. It made us and is. So let's spend some time with that great and terrible event and see if we can't understand ourselves just a little bit better. And just so you know, I'm not going to crack any Civil War jokes during this lecture because I generally don't find them funny.
It's time to kick it old school.
So in 1860, Abraham Lincoln was voted into office as the President of the United States without a single vote from Southern voters. And as a result of this offense, South Carolina made good on its promise to secede from the Union, followed by 6 other Southern states, while 8 others toyed with the idea of joining the Confederacy. And if you had been in Washington, D.C. in 1861, the night before Lincoln took his oath of office, you would not have seen him arrive, because he arrived under the cloak of darkness and in disguise because he was afraid of being assassinated. That's how tense things were. But the lanky new president delivered his inaugural address and affirmed 2 very important points. First, that as president his job was to preserve the Union at all costs. And second, that there would be no armed conflict unless the South provoked it. And the South went ahead and provoked it at a federal fort in Charleston by the name of Fort Sumter. You see, even though Fort Sumter was within the territory of the Confederacy, it was still manned with federal troops. Now, it wasn't a lot of federal troops, maybe less than 100, but at this point their food and ammunition began running low and they needed to be reinforced. And so now Lincoln is in a bind. South Carolina declared that any reinforcements that were sent to Fort Sumter would be met with force. So Lincoln decided to take a middle road and send food to the fort, but not arms. Which is to say that the troops at Fort Sumter would be provisioned, but not reinforced. But the South Carolinians interpreted any kind of provision as reinforcement. And so on April 12, 1861, South Carolinian forces opened cannon fire on Fort Sumter, and after 34 hours of fire, the Union garrison surrendered. And at the news of this, Lincoln issued an immediate call for 75,000 militiamen, and they came in droves. That call for troops consequently enraged the South, who issued their own call for troops, and now we're sliding down the hill rapidly into a proper kind of war. And now that we've got Northerners and Southerners shooting at each other, it'd probably be good to consider some of the advantages and disadvantages each of them brought into the conflict. Let's begin with the South. Now, at the outset of the war, it seemed like the South had everything going for it. First of all, the South had the advantage of fighting a defensive war on its own territory. They didn't have to do any of the invading. All they had to do was hold Union forces off long enough until they tired out. Second, the South had all the talent in terms of officers. They had the stately Robert E. Lee and Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson, who was a master of military tactics and battlefield sleight of hand. Third, most Southerners were bred to fight. You better give your heart to Jesus, 'cause your butt is mine. But the South also had some significant weaknesses. Since the South was basically one gigantic farm, they lacked a robust transportation structure, and that led to another problem, namely the food problem. Though farmers had crops to spare, the lack of railroads made it difficult to get that food to the troops. And more than all of that, the most significant weakness of the South was its economy. All the industrial power of the nation was focused in the North, and eventually this led to a severe shortage of proper clothing and blankets to keep suffering troops warm in the winter. And now let's talk about the North. If the economy was the most significant weakness of the South, the economy was the greatest strength of the North. The North had plenty of farms, but there were also factories as far as the eye could see. Now, the North possessed about 3/4 of the nation's wealth and about 30,000 miles of railroads. Now, the second advantage of the northern side was that they had control of the sea. The Northern Navy was vastly superior to the South's, and as they put a blockade in place around the eastern seaboard, they began to starve the South out. The North's third advantage was that they had way more men from which to draw troops than did the South. However, the North had two lasting weaknesses. First, Northern men were not bred for fighting like Southerners, and therefore they were more ill-suited for military life. Second, the North often suffered from turdish officers. Until Lincoln found that magnificent General Ulysses S. Grant, he had to rely on trial and error to find good officers. Emphasis on error. Okay, now that the stage is set, let's get back to the war. Lincoln was convinced that this would be a short war, so he decided to send a giant dispatch of Union troops to confront a much smaller Confederate force at Bull Run. The idea was to clinch a strong victory and overwhelm the Confederate troops and stitch up the national wound nice and clean. And at first, the Union Army dominated the Confederates, but Stonewall Jackson held the line firm. You could almost say he held it like a stone wall. And when Confederate reinforcements arrived, scores of inexperienced Union soldiers fled. And a few months later, Union and Confederate armies clashed again at the Second Battle of Bull Run, and under the leadership of Robert E. Lee, the Confederates whipped the Yankees again. It was not going well for Lincoln. And it's at this point that Lincoln realizes a new strategy is needed. He had long since abandoned the idea that this was going to be a short and brief war. And for all his conviction that this war was about preserving the Union, he hatched a plan that would forever change the shape of the war and the meaning of the war, and he hoped lead him to the long road to victory. And he wrote down his plan in a document called the Emancipation Proclamation. And if you want to see whether or not it worked, you'll have to tune in for part 2. I'll see you next time.